Dad, please stop. You need to read this letter first.
Dad, you forgot one part of the story. The words came from the front row of the ballroom, spoken by an 8-year-old boy whose voice was quiet enough to make everyone lean forward. The music stopped. Conversations faded. Even the bride, standing beneath a wall of white flowers, turned toward the child. Beside him sat his identical twin, Liam, holding a cream-colored envelope tightly in both hands. Their mother, Emily Harper, remained seated a few rows behind them, perfectly still. She had promised her sons they would wait until their father finished speaking. She had not promised them how long they would have to wait. At the altar stood Alexander Sterling, one of the most successful CEOs in America, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, surrounded by people who had spent years admiring his success. Tonight was supposed to be the celebration of his new life. The hotel ballroom was filled with polished marble, crystal chandeliers, white roses, and nearly 300 guests. Business partners sat beside politicians, investors beside celebrities, and members of Alexander's family near the front. Everyone had come to witness a perfect beginning. Nobody expected two little boys to interrupt it. Alexander stared at his sons as if he had never seen them before. His expression changed slowly, from confusion to recognition, and then to something Emily could not read from across the room. The boy standing in the front row looked at him again. "Are you going to tell them?" he asked. "Or should I?" A murmur moved through the ballroom. Emily lowered her eyes for one brief second. She had imagined this moment many times, but imagination had never included the sound of her son's voice carrying through a room filled with strangers. Liam looked at his brother and whispered, "Wait." Then he placed one hand over the envelope. Emily could see the familiar handwriting on the front. Their father's name. Alexander stepped away from the altar. "Boys," he said carefully, "this is not the time." The older twin looked toward his mother. Emily gave him the smallest nod. Not permission to expose everything, just permission to speak the truth they had carried for years. The boy turned back toward his father. "You said everyone here knows your family." Alexander stopped. Nobody moved. The bride looked from Alexander to the two children, her face filled with questions she had never thought to ask. Emily could feel her heartbeat, but her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "Let them finish." Alexander looked at her. For the first time that evening, their eyes met across the room. There was no anger in Emily's expression, no demand, no plea, only the calm certainty of someone who had waited long enough. 8 years earlier, she had believed the man standing at that altar was the person she would grow old beside. 8 years earlier, she had believed their family would always belong together. She had been wrong about one thing. The family had never disappeared. It had simply been kept out of sight. Now her twin sons were sitting in the front row of their father's wedding, holding the one thing Alexander had spent years trying to keep buried. And when the boy slowly lifted the envelope, every person in the room understood that this wedding was no longer only about a new beginning. It was about a truth that had been waiting for its moment. 8 years earlier, before the chandeliers and the white roses, before the carefully arranged guest list and the cameras waiting outside, Emily Harper had believed that Alexander Sterling was simply a brilliant man with a difficult dream. They had met when he was still working from a small office in downtown Chicago, where the coffee was cheap, the furniture was mismatched, and every dollar had to be counted twice. Emily had stayed beside him through the uncertain years. She answered emails late at night, reviewed invoices at the kitchen table, and listened when he talked about building a company that would one day change the way people did business. She never cared about the money because, back then, there was barely enough of it to matter. What mattered was the promise. They would build something together. Then the company grew. One investment became another, the small office became a glass tower, and Alexander's name began appearing in business magazines. Emily watched it happen from a few steps behind him. At first, nothing seemed different. Alexander still came home for dinner. He still asked about her day. He still smiled when she told him they were expecting twins. But success has a way of changing the rhythm of a life before anyone notices. Meetings became longer. Travel became constant. Invitations arrived from people Emily had never met. Slowly, the woman who had once been beside him in every decision became someone waiting at home. When their sons, Lucas and Liam, were born, Emily believed the arrival of their children would bring them closer again. For a while it did. Alexander held each baby carefully and promised that nothing would ever matter more than his family. Emily remembered those words because she had believed every one of them. The twins grew quickly, with the same light brown hair and the same curious eyes, but completely different personalities. Lucas was thoughtful and observant. Liam was more willing to ask questions. Together, they filled the house with laughter, toy cars, school papers, and the ordinary noise Emily had once feared she might never have. Then Alexander began talking about image. He said investors wanted stability. He said the company was entering a new stage. He said every detail of his personal life could affect the business. Emily listened as the man she loved slowly began separating his public life from the family that had supported him. One evening, after the twins had gone to sleep, Alexander placed a folder on the dining table. "I think we need to make some changes," he said. Emily looked at the papers, but did not touch them. "What kind of changes?" He spoke carefully. Their marriage was no longer working, he said. Their lives had moved in different directions. He wanted a clean beginning. Emily stared at him for a long moment, trying to find the man from the little office where their dreams had started. She could still see him in her memory, sitting across from her with a paper cup of coffee and a notebook filled with impossible plans. But the man sitting across the table now seemed to belong to another world. Emily signed the agreement several weeks later. She did not fight for his money. She did not ask for his company. She asked only for a peaceful life for her sons. What Alexander did not understand was that Emily was carrying a truth he had never fully considered. Their family had not ended with the divorce. Two little boys were growing up with his eyes, his questions, and his name. And while Alexander built a public life that looked perfect from the outside, Emily quietly built a private one where Lucas and Liam would always know who they were. Years later, when the wedding invitation arrived, she almost threw it away. Then Liam asked a simple question. "Is that where Dad is getting married?" Emily looked at her sons and knew there were some truths children should never have to carry alone. But there were also truths that could not remain hidden forever. The envelope had been sitting in Emily's bedroom for 3 days before she finally allowed Lucas and Liam to see it. It was not large, only a few sheets of paper sealed inside a cream-colored envelope. But Emily had treated it as if every word could change the direction of their lives. The twins sat across from her at the kitchen table, their school backpacks resting on the floor beside their chairs. Outside the window, an early Chicago evening had settled over the neighborhood, and the last orange light of the day rested against the glass. Liam reached toward the envelope, then stopped. "What is inside?" Emily looked at both boys before answering. "Something from a long time ago." Lucas studied her face. He had always noticed when adults were trying to hide worry. "Does it belong to Dad?" Emily nodded. "Part of it does." The boys exchanged a glance. They had known for years that Alexander was their father. Emily had never lied to them about that. She had shown them photographs when they were younger, answered their questions carefully, and never spoken badly about him. But there had always been one question she could not answer. Why did he never come to see them? Why did he send birthday gifts through other people instead of knocking on their door? Why did their classmates sometimes ask about their father while they had to explain that he lived somewhere else? Emily had always said, "There are things adults need to work out." She had hoped time would make the answer easier. Instead, the questions had grown with the boys. Lucas finally touched the envelope. "Did Dad send this?" "No," Emily said. "It was kept by someone who believed you should know the truth when you were old enough to understand it." Liam looked toward his brother. "What truth?" Emily took a slow breath. "I am not going to tell you what to believe about your father. I want you to decide that for yourselves." She opened a drawer and removed an old photograph. It showed Alexander years earlier, standing outside the first office where his company had begun. He looked younger, less polished, almost ordinary. Lucas took the photograph and smiled faintly. "He looks different." "He was different," Emily said. Then she placed the photograph beside the envelope. "Your father knew about you." The room became quiet. Liam's expression changed. "He knew?" Emily nodded. "I believe he did." Lucas looked at the envelope again. "Then why did he not come?" Emily did not answer immediately. That was the hardest question because she had spent years believing she knew the answer. But recently, she had begun to wonder whether the story she had accepted was incomplete. The envelope had come from Alexander's late mother, Margaret Sterling. It had been delivered to Emily through an attorney several months earlier, with a handwritten note asking her to open it only when the boys were old enough to understand what it meant. Emily had waited. She had waited until Lucas and Liam could read difficult words without turning every sentence into a game. She had waited until they were old enough to understand that adults could make choices based on fear, pride, or misunderstanding. Now she slid the envelope across the table. "You do not have to open it tonight." Liam looked at his mother. "But we are going to the wedding." Emily nodded. "Yes. And Dad will be there." "Yes." Lucas picked up the envelope and held it carefully. "Then maybe he should know what is inside." Emily looked at her sons and felt the weight of the years between the divorce and tonight. She had spent so long protecting them from disappointment that she had forgotten they deserved the chance to understand their own story. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Lucas's. "If you decide to tell him," she said quietly, "tell him because you want the truth to be known, not because you want to hurt him." Lucas nodded. Liam leaned closer to the envelope. Neither boy opened it. Not yet. They would wait until the wedding. And somewhere across Chicago, Alexander was preparing to stand in front of hundreds of people and speak about the perfect family he believed he had built. He had no idea that the two sons he had kept at the edge of his public life were already holding the first piece of the truth in their hands. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on thick ivory paper with Alexander Sterling's name embossed in dark blue across the front. Emily had seen his name countless times in newspapers, business magazines, and television interviews, but seeing it on an invitation still made her pause. The ceremony would take place at one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels, overlooking Lake Michigan, with a guest list filled with investors, executives, and people whose names appeared beside Alexander's in the business pages. Emily placed the invitation on the kitchen counter and walked away. She had no intention of attending. Not at first. For years, she had kept Alexander's world separate from hers. Lucas and Liam knew their father existed, but they had learned not to expect phone calls or visits. Their lives were quieter without the constant attention that followed his name. They had a small house, a comfortable routine, and a mother who made sure they never believed they were missing anything. Then Liam found the invitation. He was standing beside the counter after school, still wearing his blue school jacket, when he noticed the envelope. "Is that from Dad?" Emily turned around. "Yes." Lucas came into the kitchen behind him. "What does he want?" Emily picked up the invitation. "He is getting married." The twins looked at each other. They had known Alexander had another life. They had seen photographs online. They knew about the company, the expensive cars, the interviews, and the large offices with his name displayed on the wall. But knowing about someone was different from knowing them. Liam touched the edge of the invitation. "Are we invited?" Emily hesitated. "All three of us are." Lucas frowned. "Why?" Emily had asked herself the same question. Perhaps Alexander wanted to appear generous. Perhaps someone on his wedding planning team believed inviting his former wife and children would make the event look mature and peaceful. Or perhaps Alexander had finally decided he wanted his sons nearby. Emily did not know. "You do not have to go," she said. Liam looked at his brother again. "I want to." Lucas nodded slowly. "Me too." Emily studied their faces. She had spent years protecting them from the disappointment of a father who had chosen distance. She did not want the wedding to become another lesson in rejection. "If we go," she said, "we go for you. Not to make a scene. Not to embarrass anyone. We stay together, and if either of you feels uncomfortable, we leave." Liam nodded. "Okay." Lucas looked at the invitation again. "Will Dad talk to us?" Emily's expression softened. "I do not know." That answer seemed to stay with all three of them. The following days passed quietly. Emily bought the boys matching navy suits, simple enough for a formal wedding, but comfortable enough for them to remain themselves. They practiced their manners, discussed when to stand, and even argued over who would sit closer to the aisle. The ordinary details made the situation feel almost normal. Almost. On Friday evening, Emily found Lucas sitting on the edge of his bed, holding the cream-colored envelope from Margaret Sterling. He had not opened it. "Are you nervous?" Emily asked. He nodded. "A little." Liam appeared in the doorway. "Mom." If Dad says we are his family, then why did he never tell people about us? Emily sat beside them. She did not have an easy answer. Sometimes adults make choices they regret. Sometimes they are afraid of what people will think. Lucas looked down at the envelope. What if he is not afraid anymore? Emily gently touched his shoulder. Then tomorrow, you will find out. She looked at the two boys, then at the envelope resting between them. The wedding was only one day away. Emily still did not know what Margaret had left behind. She only knew that whatever was inside had waited 8 years to be opened. And tomorrow, for the first time, Alexander would have to look directly at the two sons he had kept outside his public life. The morning of the wedding arrived with a pale Chicago sunrise spreading across the kitchen windows. Emily woke before the boys and stood quietly at the counter, preparing coffee while the house remained still. On the table beside her sat the cream-colored envelope from Margaret Sterling. She had carried it from room to room for days, never opening it, never letting herself forget what it might contain. At 8:30, Lucas appeared in the doorway wearing one sock and holding his tie. "Mom, I cannot make this work." Emily smiled despite herself. "You have not even started." Liam came behind him, already dressed, his hair carefully combed. "I told him to use the blue tie." Lucas looked at his brother. "You said the blue one makes me look serious. You need to look serious." Emily laughed softly. For a few minutes, the tension disappeared beneath ordinary family chaos. Then she noticed the envelope again. Lucas followed her eyes. "Are we opening it now?" Emily looked at the clock. The wedding ceremony would begin at 4 in the afternoon. "Not yet." Liam frowned. "Why not?" "Because once we open it, we cannot pretend we do not know what it says." The boys became quiet. Emily sat down with them at the table. "Whatever is inside, remember this. You are not responsible for fixing anything between your father and me." Lucas nodded. "But if he lied about us, we should know why." Emily looked at him carefully. "Yes, you deserve the truth." At noon, they drove downtown. The hotel rose above the surrounding buildings, its glass entrance reflecting the bright summer sky. Staff members moved through the lobby carrying flowers and neatly arranged programs. Guests arrived in formal clothing, speaking softly as they checked their invitations. Emily felt the old instinct to turn around. She had spent years avoiding rooms like this because they belonged to Alexander's world. Then Liam slipped his hand into hers. "We are together." Emily looked down at him and smiled. "Yes, we are." A wedding coordinator greeted them and led them toward the ballroom. "Mr. Sterling asked that the boys have seats in the front row," she said. Emily paused. "He did." "Yes. He wanted them close to the family." The words sounded innocent, but Emily could not ignore the strange weight they carried. "Family." She looked at Lucas and Liam. Neither boy spoke. They simply followed her inside. The ballroom was almost ready. White flowers lined the aisle, candles rested on every table, and sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. At the front, a large arrangement of white roses stood beneath a simple arch. Everything was beautiful. Everything was carefully planned. And yet Emily could not stop thinking about the envelope. Before the ceremony, she took the boys into a quiet hallway. "Do you want to open it?" she asked. Lucas looked at Liam. Liam nodded. Emily handed them the envelope. Lucas carefully broke the seal. Inside were several documents and a handwritten letter from Margaret. The first line was enough to make Emily's breath catch. "Emily, if you are reading this with my grandsons beside you, then the time has come for them to know what their father chose to hide." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Liam looked up. "Mom." She opened them again. "Keep reading." Lucas continued silently, his expression changing with every line. Then he looked at his mother. He knew. Emily's heart sank. "What does it say?" Lucas swallowed. "It says Dad knew about us before the divorce was final." The hallway seemed suddenly too quiet. Emily had suspected it for years, but suspicion was different from proof. Liam looked toward the ballroom doors. Then why did he say he wanted a clean beginning? Emily had no answer. Inside the ballroom, the first notes of the ceremony music began. Guests were taking their seats. Alexander was about to walk toward the altar. Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. "We are not going to ruin anything," she said softly. "We are going to listen." Lucas held the envelope against his chest. Liam took his mother's hand. Together, they entered the ballroom and walked toward the front row. Alexander looked across the room as they sat down. His eyes stopped on the envelope in Lucas's hands. For one brief moment, the confident billionaire CEO looked completely still. Then the music began, and the wedding continued as if nothing had changed. The ceremony continued, but Emily could no longer hear the words clearly. She sat in the front section with Lucas and Liam beside her, watching Alexander stand beneath the white floral arch as if the last 8 years had never happened. The bride stood beside him, smiling for the guests, unaware that a sealed letter was resting only a few feet away. Emily kept her hands folded in her lap. She had promised herself she would not create a scene. Whatever happened next had to come from the truth, not from anger. When the ceremony ended, the guests applauded and rose from their seats. Alexander turned toward the room, his expression polished and confident again. His eyes found Emily almost immediately. Then they moved to the envelope in Lucas's hands. For a moment, he did not move. The bride touched his arm and whispered something. Alexander answered quietly before looking back at Emily. During the reception, the boys remained close to their mother. Servers moved between tables carrying sparkling water, coffee, and elegant plates of food. Soft music filled the ballroom while guests congratulated the newly married couple. Everything looked peaceful on the surface, but Emily noticed that Alexander kept glancing toward the twins. Finally, he approached their table. "Emily," he said quietly. She looked up. "Alexander." His eyes moved toward Lucas and Liam. "Can I speak with you?" Emily glanced at the boys. "You can speak here." Alexander lowered his voice. "Not in front of them." Liam looked at him. "Why not?" Alexander seemed surprised by the question. "Because some conversations are for adults." Lucas placed the envelope on the table. "Is this one of them?" Alexander stared at it. The color seemed to leave his face. Emily watched him carefully. "Your mother left this for the boys," she said. "She believed they deserved to know the truth." Alexander looked toward the crowded ballroom. "You should not have brought that here." Emily remained calm. "I did not bring it to expose you." "Then why are you here?" he asked. Emily looked at the boys. "Because they were invited." Alexander glanced at them again. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the children were no longer small enough to be kept outside adult decisions. "You told them?" he asked. "I told them what I knew." "And what exactly do you think you know?" Emily paused. "That you knew about them before the divorce was final." Alexander said nothing. The music continued behind them, but the space around their table felt strangely separate from the celebration. Liam looked at his father. "Did you know?" Alexander opened his mouth, then stopped. Lucas waited. Emily waited too. He finally said, "There were circumstances you do not understand." Liam frowned. "We are 8. Alexander looked toward Emily. "This is not the place." Emily answered softly. "Then tell them when you are ready. But do not tell them they imagined it." Alexander stepped back. His eyes remained on the envelope. "Where did you get that?" "Your mother." His expression changed again. "My mother?" Emily nodded. "She wanted the boys to have it when they were old enough." Alexander looked toward the ballroom entrance, where guests were beginning to gather for the wedding photographs. His perfect evening was still moving forward around him, but something had shifted. He could no longer decide which parts of his past belonged in public and which parts could remain hidden. Lucas reached for the envelope and held it close. "Dad," he said quietly, "we do not want to ruin your wedding." Alexander looked at him. "Then what do you want?" Lucas answered with the simplest words in the room. "We want to know why you never told anyone about us." Alexander had no immediate answer. Emily saw the uncertainty in his face and realized that the question he had spent 8 years avoiding had finally found him. Not through a lawsuit, not through a newspaper, not through a public accusation. It had arrived in the voice of his own son, sitting in the front row of the family celebration Alexander had carefully designed. "Dad, you keep saying we are not part of your story, so why is Grandma's letter saying you knew about us?" Lucas asked. The question was quiet, but it carried across the small space between the family table and the ballroom entrance. Alexander looked at his son for several seconds without answering. Around them, wedding guests continued talking, laughing, and taking photographs, unaware that the most important conversation of the evening was happening only a few feet away. Emily watched Alexander carefully. She had seen that expression before, years ago, when he was trying to decide which answer would protect his reputation. This time, however, the audience was different. His sons were listening. "Lucas," Alexander finally said, "there are things about the past that your mother and I remember differently." Emily did not react. "Then tell them your version," she said. Alexander looked at her. You know why the marriage ended? Yes, Emily replied. But that does not answer their question. Liam leaned forward. Did you know about us before the divorce? Alexander looked at both boys. The music from the reception continued softly behind them. He could have denied it. He could have blamed paperwork, confusion, timing, or anyone else. Instead, he lowered his eyes for a moment. Yes, he said. Liam's face changed. Lucas remained still. When Lucas asked, Alexander took a breath. Before the divorce was final. The boys looked at each other. Emily felt something inside her settle. She had spent years wondering whether she had misunderstood those final weeks of her marriage. Now she had an answer. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. Then why did you never tell anyone? Liam asked. Alexander glanced toward the ballroom. At that time, the company was preparing for a major transition. I believe my personal life could create complications. Lucas frowned. Complications because of us? Alexander immediately shook his head. No, it was not because of you. Then because of Mom? Alexander hesitated. Emily could see that he was searching for another safe explanation. I thought I was protecting the company, he said. Lucas looked down at the envelope. Grandma said you were protecting your image. Alexander went silent. The words had come from his own mother, and that made them harder to dismiss. Emily had never wanted her sons to hate their father. She had never told them that Alexander had chosen his career over them. She had simply told them that adults sometimes made choices they later regretted. But now the boys were old enough to hear the truth directly from him. I was afraid, Alexander finally admitted. Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of what would happen to the company. Afraid that everything I had built would become a story about my private life instead of my work. Liam looked at him with the uncomplicated honesty only a child could have. So you hit us. Alexander's eyes lowered. Yes. The single word seemed to change the room. Emily did not celebrate the admission. There was nothing to celebrate. She simply watched her sons absorb something they had wondered about for years. Lucas picked up the envelope. Then Grandma knew. Alexander nodded slowly. She did. And she wanted us to know? Yes. Lucas looked toward his mother. Emily gave him a small nod. Then the wedding coordinator approached, reminding Alexander that the family photographs were about to begin. Alexander looked toward the ballroom, then back at his sons. For the first time that evening, he seemed torn between the life he had carefully presented to hundreds of guests and the two boys standing in front of him. Lucas held out the envelope. You can read it too. Alexander stared at the letter in his son's hand. He did not take it immediately. Why? He asked. Lucas answered. Because it is about all of us. Alexander finally accepted the envelope. Inside the ballroom, the photographer called for the newly married couple. Guests gathered beneath the white flowers. The celebration waited. But Alexander remained where he was, reading the first lines of his mother's letter, while Emily stood quietly beside her sons. The truth had not destroyed the wedding. It had simply changed what everyone in that room would eventually understand about the man standing at its center. Alexander stood beneath the soft ballroom lights with his mother's letter open in his hands, and for several seconds he seemed unable to turn the page. The voices around him had grown distant. Guests were still gathering for photographs. The musicians were preparing for the next part of the reception, and the newly married couple were expected to smile for the cameras. Yet Alexander remained focused on the handwriting he had not seen in years. Margaret's words were calm, almost gentle, but every sentence carried the weight of something she had wanted her son to understand long before this evening. She wrote that she had known about Lucas and Liam from the beginning. She wrote that Emily had never tried to keep the boys away from him. She wrote that Alexander had been given opportunities to be present, but he had chosen distance because he feared what the truth might do to the life he was building. Alexander lowered the letter. Emily watched from a few feet away, her sons standing quietly beside her. Is it true? Alexander asked. Emily did not need to ask what he meant. You already know it is. He looked toward Lucas and Liam. I should have told you myself. Lucas answered softly. Why did you not? Alexander had no polished answer now. There were no investors to impress, no interview cameras waiting, and no business advisors reminding him to protect his image. There were only two boys who had spent years wondering why their father existed mostly in photographs. I thought I was protecting everything I had built, he said. Liam looked at him. But we were part of what you built. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. The sentence was simple, but it reached somewhere deeper than any accusation could have. Emily remembered the early years, when Alexander had promised that success would never change him. She had wanted to believe him. Perhaps some part of him had wanted to believe it too. The bride approached slowly, her expression uncertain. She had heard enough to understand that something important had been hidden from her as well. "Alexander," she said quietly, "who are these boys?" Alexander looked at her, then at his sons. This was the moment he could no longer choose a convenient explanation. "They are my sons," he said. The words were quiet, but Emily felt their meaning settle over the room. Lucas looked at Liam. Neither smiled. They had not come for a dramatic announcement. They had come because they wanted their father to say those words where other people could hear them. The bride looked toward Emily. "I did not know." Emily nodded. "I know." Alexander's wife looked at him, waiting for an explanation. He could only offer the truth. "I made a decision years ago. I believed keeping them private would protect my career and the company. I was wrong." The photographer remained at a distance, unsure whether to continue. Emily noticed the hesitation and gave a small shake of her head. No photographs were necessary. This moment belonged to the people standing in front of her. Lucas slowly opened the envelope again and removed another page. Grandma wrote something else. Alexander looked at him. "What?" Lucas read carefully. "She said a family does not become less real because someone is afraid to acknowledge it." Alexander looked down. For years, he had believed control meant deciding what the world was allowed to know. Now he understood that hiding a truth did not make it disappear. It only made the people carrying it heavier. Liam stepped closer to his father, but he did not reach for him. "Are we allowed to be your sons now?" Alexander looked at both boys. His voice was unsteady when he answered. "You always were." Emily felt her eyes grow warm, but she did not look away. She had spent 8 years protecting her children from a truth they had never caused. Tonight, they had finally heard it from the person who owed it to them. Alexander turned toward the ballroom and saw hundreds of people waiting for the celebration to continue. But something had changed. He no longer needed to protect the perfect story. The real one was standing beside him, holding his mother's letter. And for the first time, Alexander understood that the greatest thing he had hidden was not a scandal. It was his own family. The ballroom slowly became quiet as the truth settled into the room. Alexander stood beside Lucas and Liam, his mother's letter still in his hands, while Emily watched from a short distance away. The wedding was still taking place around them, but the meaning of the evening had changed. There would be no perfect photographs, no carefully prepared speech about a flawless future, and no simple explanation that could erase 8 years of silence. Alexander looked at his sons again. "I do not expect you to forgive me tonight," he said. Lucas nodded slowly. "We did not come here to make you say sorry." Liam added, "We just wanted you to say we are your sons." Alexander's eyes softened. "You are my sons." This time, he did not whisper the words. A few nearby guests heard him, and then others turned toward the conversation. Emily could feel the attention gathering, but she did not step forward. She had spent years wishing Alexander would take responsibility for his choices. Now that he finally had the chance, she would let him do it himself. The bride stood quietly beside him, still trying to understand the life she had just discovered was much larger than she had imagined. She looked at Emily. "How long have you known that he knew about them?" Emily answered honestly. "I suspected it for years. Tonight, he confirmed it." The bride looked at Alexander. "Why did you never tell me?" Alexander lowered his eyes. "Because I was afraid the truth would change how you saw me." She took a slow breath. The truth always changes something. There was no anger in her voice, only disappointment. Emily understood that feeling. She had lived with it for years. Alexander looked around the ballroom. The people who had once admired his success were now watching him as a man instead of a billionaire CEO. For the first time, his title could not solve the problem in front of him. He turned toward the boys. "I cannot change the years I missed," he said. "But I want to know you now, if you will let me." Lucas looked at Liam. They were quiet for a moment. Then Lucas asked, "Would you come to our school sometime?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Yes." Liam added, "And you can come to our soccer games." "I would like that." Emily watched the exchange without interrupting. She knew better than anyone that forgiveness was not a single moment. It was something built slowly through actions, consistency, and time. She would not promise her sons that everything would suddenly become perfect. She would only let them decide what relationship they wanted with their father. Alexander turned to Emily. I owe you an apology too. She looked at him calmly. You do? He nodded. I am sorry I made you carry all of this alone. Emily took a breath. For years, she had imagined hearing those words. Yet when they finally came, they did not feel like victory. They simply felt like the end of a long wait. Thank you, she said. But the apology matters only if your actions change. Alexander nodded. They will. Emily did not promise anything in return. She simply reached for her son's hands. The three of them walked toward the ballroom doors as the music began again behind them. Outside, the Chicago night was cool and clear, with the lights of the city reflecting across the windows. Lucas looked up at his mother. Are we leaving? Yes. Liam smiled. Are we okay? Emily looked at both boys. We are more than okay. They stepped outside together. Behind them, the wedding continued, but Emily no longer cared what happened inside. She had not come to take anything from Alexander. She had come because her sons deserved to know where they belonged. For 8 years, Alexander had tried to protect his name by keeping his family out of sight. In the end, it was not a scandal that changed his story. It was two boys asking their father for the simple dignity of being acknowledged. Emily walked beside them beneath the Chicago lights, listening to their quiet conversation about school, soccer, and what they might do the following weekend. She smiled. The future was no longer something she had to protect them from. It was something they could finally build together. And as the hotel doors closed behind them, Emily realized that the most important truth had never been about what Alexander had hidden. It was about what she had built while he was looking the other way. Two sons who knew their worth, a life filled with love, and the quiet freedom to walk forward without waiting for anyone else to define her family.